Art, Fascism and Democracy. The Politics of Division versus the Politics of Inclusion is a unique European project using the arts and new digital technologies to reflect on the ending of the Spanish Civil War and World War II, and to explore the stories of artists and activists who stood up for democracy and against fascism in a time of war. The project brings together artists and organisations across Europe to work collaboratively and is supported by Europe for Citizens.
Hi, my name is Dil Vikramasinghe. I'm a journalist and director of Inside Matters, and it gives me great pleasure indeed to be here today to work with Smashing Times and in relation to this unique project, which is Artists Against Fascism. And it gives me great pleasure to moderate this panel, which is really going to be talking about the theme of the panel discussion is going to be about the politics of division versus the politics of inclusion, because we're all very concerned, and we have been for a number of years, in relation to the rise of the right, and how do we create a more compassionate, more inclusive, more diverse society where we can all live together and be able to speak our minds, but to do so in a way that's compassionate and mindful of other people's mental health. So civil rights includes freedom of speech, as I said, and the right to vote, media, and open debate, which are indispensable parts of democracy. So how do we, I suppose, preserve that democracy and ensure that people can be open about their thoughts and opinions, but do so in a respectful and compassionate way. And I'm thrilled that Senator Alice Mary Higgins is here to speak to you today about what can be done to prevent the rise of fascism. And she explores in a talk the role of the EU today and the power of European solidarity to promote equality. So let's have a listen to Senator Alice Mary Higgins.
The European Union parliamentary elections represented a moment when everyone was invited to participate in shaping that collective vision, in having their say in what it should mean to live together. Women were a crucial part of those decisions. Women were a crucial part of that parliament. And in turn, the European Union, by having ambitious policies, sometimes more ambitious than individual countries had, was able to set standards, raise standards, and create an ambition for equality, which drove, in turn, national equality for women in many countries, including Ireland. Right now, it's important that we have a European Union which is, again, about a collective vision, which is ambitious, calling on us to do more in terms of equality, to do more in terms of climate action, to do more in terms of a sustainable vision, and to move past simply the local and smaller concerns we might have into challenging each other for a vision of what it can mean to live together. It is around raising our collective ambition. It is around making sure that the diversity that we have within the European Union is given voice and heard. I feel that for the European Union, our diversity is the strength that we have. We are a union not because of similarities, but despite long histories of difference, long histories of conflict, and long histories of division. It is because we recognize how precious cooperation is that we can shape a better future. And indeed, if Europe can get that right, we set a model that I hope can help the rest of the world at a time when the politics of division have seeken to divide and conquer.
Thank you very much, Senator Alice Mary Higgins, for a wonderful, informative contribution. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Fernando Benavente from IFES Corp in Spain. He's from Valencia. I know we'd love to take a look outside of his window as he's speaking to us. Well, Fernando will reflect on the impact of the Spanish Civil War in Spain between 1936 and 1939 and the growth of fascism in Europe during World War II. Here's Fernando joining us now.
But how to explain the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe? The process started before World War II with the German Nazism, Italian Fascism, Spanish Francoism, and other forces comparable to these fascist movements in countries such as Austria, Hungary, or Romania. Totalitarianisms, which were growing in the 1920s and 1930s, experienced an ultra-violent outburst in the Spanish Civil War and World War II, and were presented as a renationalizing project, which, based on its extreme nationalism, aimed to regenerate the nation and to redefine society by means of force. For this, it was necessary to curtail civil society and destroy democracy. With immediate effect, the totalitarian regimes began the persecution of all political dissent and the extermination of the different in their countries, such as the Jew, the homosexual, the gypsy, and the disabled. So here in Europe, we have experienced in a very direct and stark manner what totalitarian regimes mean and represent with the harsh experience of World War II and the Holocaust. The active involvement of traditional elites in support of fascism and Nazism so as to defend their economic interests was key. This came about in the context of the growth of the workers' movement, the advent of the mass society and of democracy, but also of the accumulation of previous experience of militarism, racism, and the escalation of violence and extreme nationalism. It is important to put in value that, from an early stage, relations and networks of contact, support, solidarity, and aid were constructed between peoples of Europe, which were under threat from or already directly under the Nazi-fascist tyranny. These networks, such as the Comet Lines, will be crucial during the World War II to enable the escape and rescue of persecuted people, but also to coordinate the resistance and supply the partisan movements against the Nazi occupation. Because during the World War II, the need to escape from territory controlled by the Nazis will become a question of survival for many people, both because of their ideology and because of their ethnicity, religion, or ancestry, or also because they were soldiers and pilots who had been shot down or isolated or imprisoned in territory under Nazi occupation. The Comet Lines is a clandestine structure to support those fleeing from Nazism, assisted Allied pilots shot down in occupied territory, provided them shelter, sustenance, documentation, and accompaniment to the Spanish border, which they would clandestinely cross in order to move on to neutral Portugal or British Gibraltar. From there, they could return to Britain to continue fighting for freedom. So during World War II, Spain served as a passageway, a difficult and dangerous one, of course, for those fleeing Nazi brutality. It was given the status of non-belligerent and neutral despite being a genocidal regime and fascist as its allies Hitler and Mussolini. But there were networks for people fleeing from Franco and Spain and movement in the opposite direction, networks for people escaping from Hitler which intersected with each other.
Thank you very much, Fernando. That was really, truly powerful. And now it gives me incredible pleasure to introduce Mary Moynihan of Smashing Times, of course. She's a writer, theatre and filmmaker and artistic director of Smashing Times. And Mary will speak about her artistic processes inspired by the work of artists who stood up to fascism in Europe during the Spanish Civil War and World War II, and how those stories had inspired the creation of a new film.
This particular project is about looking at anti-fascism and looking at it in the context of the Spanish Civil War and World War II. And my role as an artist is to explore stories of artists from that period who stood up to fascism and to look at ways that we can take those stories and use them to inspire artworks today, but as well to use the stories in some way to pass on or raise awareness about what fascism is and how can we learn from remembering stories from the past. So the first thing that we did was to research artists who in that period stood up to fascism. And, you know, there's people like Irish artists were Samuel Beckett, and Samuel Beckett is well known as a playwright and a writer, but he was also involved in the French resistance, and he was, I suppose it's something that was not known for a long time, but he risked his life for to stand up against the Nazis, and he joined a resistance unit, and at a certain point that unit was betrayed, and Beckett and his partner Suzanne barely, they avoided arrest, and because of that they had to leave their home in Paris and go on the run, and they spent the remainder of the war on the run in the south of France. And after the war, Samuel Beckett, he returned to Ireland to visit his mother, but then he came back to France, and he came back, instead of coming back to Paris, he came back to a town called Saint-Lô in Normandy in northern France. And I think it's an interesting story because he came back and he worked as, you know, one point it said that he was a janitor, but he basically worked in a hospital, and he was like an orderly in the hospital. And it was a hospital set up by the Irish Red Cross in this town that had been completely destroyed by the bombings during the war. So something like 90% of the town was flattened, and there was utter destruction and devastation. And they basically built a shack in the middle of all this destruction, and they set up a hospital, and people started to return. And Beckett himself describes how people came back and they lived in cellars, they lived in spaces in the rubble. And he said as well that what happened too was that there was food at that time in the town. So what you had was German prisoners of war and people who had been made homeless by the war all gathered in this town, and they came because of food, but what they did was they also came as well to rebuild the city, or rebuild this town. And there was a quote about humanity in the ruins, and Beckett talks about this idea of finding a smile on someone's face. So people who are working together in the hospital, people who are working in this devastation, that they find the humanity in each other, and this idea of a smile, no matter how bad things are, and the fact that there's always hope, and people have come together to rebuild. And I thought that was interesting, this idea of humanity in the ruins. And for me, that's what strikes me about a lot of these stories, because the other artist that we came across was, there's a young Spanish photographer called Francisco Bois, and he was a young man who was involved in the Spanish Civil War. His father fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he was was into photography, and he fought in the Spanish Civil War. And when the fascists took over, he fled over the mountains into France, and Bois was incarcerated in a camp there. And then in order to get away from the camp, he joined, which was really forced labour, and he went marching to work with I think it was with the French army, and he was eventually arrested by the Nazis and incarcerated in Mauthausen, which is in Austria. And he spent several years in Mauthausen with other Spanish prisoners, and Bois himself is known for hiding negatives that were taken in the camps of the deaths that were happening in the camps. So Bois and other prisoners in the camps managed to hide negatives of all the photographs that were taken and sneak them out of the camps. And after the war, these negatives were used in the Nuremberg trials, and they were used as evidence against the Nazi war criminals who denied being involved in these camps. And Bois himself was the only Spanish person to give evidence at the Nuremberg trials. There was other artists like Gerda Taro, who is from Germany, and she was a photographer. And we all know of Robert Capa, but nobody knows of the fact that there was actually a partnership between Robert Capa and Gerda Taro, and she's considered possibly one of the first women war photographers. And she went to photograph the Spanish Civil War, and we have her photographs today of the the Republicans fighting in the Spanish Civil War, and Gerda was killed at the front in the Spanish Civil War. And again, not a lot was known about her for a long time, and it's only in recent years that her photographs have started to be given the credit for a wonderful record of what happened in the past. And there's other, there was other artists like Margaret Kelly, and she was an Irish woman as well, and she's famous for setting up the Bluebell Girls, who were part of the Lido, so a famous dance troupe in Paris. And Margaret Kelly became one of the top choreographers in the world. And again, I'd never heard of her, but it's wonderful to have the opportunity to find these stories and use these stories to create film. And that's what we're doing. We've created a film, which is basically our narrator is telling us or introducing us to the stories of these different artists and looking at, for me, what I have zoned in on is very much about where's the bravery and the courage and the humanity of what these artists did. So, they can be involved in actions and we can know about the actions, but what's behind that? What's the emotional context of where these people came from? What made them risk their lives? What made them want to stand up for the rights of others? What made them hold on to that piece of humanity in themselves when all around them democracy is being destroyed, freedom is being destroyed, and there is, I suppose, fascism on the rise. And hopefully the film will give a sense of the lives of these artists, but also as well talk about what it was like to live under a fascist regime. Because as an artist, I believe in freedom. I believe in freedom of expression. And as an artist, I believe in the idea of being who you are and what you want to be and expressing what that is, no matter what that is. And I think that for artists, this idea of being able to be who we are is really important. And that's one of the first things to go when you have a fascist society. So I've been hearing recently about fascism is to do with the strong man. And I've started to realise that I don't think it's about a strong man. I think it's about, for me, the strong people are the people who stand up to fascism. The people who have strength are the ones who, despite the odds, are still prepared to hold on to their humanity and not lose it. And people like Franco and people like Hitler and people like Mussolini, who were the leaders of fascism back then, and we have our leaders of fascism today. We have Putin in Russia, we have fascism in Belarus, we have fascism in Hungary, we have fascism in Poland at the moment. So when people say we need to watch the rise of fascism, it's not coming, it's already here. We have a president in the United States who is showing signs of a dictator, and a dictator is part of the fascist society. And I think this idea of we need to really watch out in society for what it is to be able to be express who we are, express the right of the individual and stand up for the individual. And that is to do with human rights. So what do we need to do in order to stand up for the rights of other people? And I'm delighted to see more and more artists are starting to use their art to raise awareness of what it is to have human rights in society. And I think that's why it's important we celebrate these artists who are involved in the film that we're making, because their artwork is fantastic. And in some cases, their artwork doesn't directly talk about fascism or doesn't talk about the circumstances that happened when you start to lose democracy and things like that. Beckett's work is very much like that. He never mentions any of those things, but yet all his work is about the bleakness of war and the bleakness of a life when humanity is taken. And then there are some artists who are very overt about what they're saying. So it's great to have the opportunity to tell these stories, and I hope that younger generations will become aware of who these artists were and obviously support artists today who are using their work to stand up to fascism.
And now we're going to hear from two young women, Carla Ryan and Ellen O'Mahony, speaking to us about their concerns and their views of the unfortunate rise of the right, especially on the internet, and how this is having an impact on young people today.
So, Ellen.
Carla.
When you think of fascism, which is quite a big word nowadays, what is it the first thing that comes to mind?
So the first thing that comes to mind is like what we learned in school about it and how, like growing up, you just think that it's a thing of the past.
Yeah.
And nowadays you're seeing that it's not, you know, you're seeing everyone is getting a lot more divided. You know, personally, I'd say that I'm more left-wing, and my part of the internet that I see, I think everyone is the same. But now I'm starting to see more right-wing views, especially in people my own age, which is just really strange to me.
And it's weird, like, as well, how you're saying, like, it's your corner of the internet, which is a very similar corner. Like, I see the same things that you see. We have really similar views. So it's like, it's kind of this weird, like, other world, because when you're out for a drink, out for dinner or something, you're not going to go, oh yes, there's the right-wing people, there's the fascists.
Yeah.
But it's when you go on the internet, it's so clear. It's like people can, like, nearly brand themselves as, like, this is my view.
Exactly, yeah. And it's so weird because I'm seeing people who grew up in the same area as me, were exposed to the same kind of lifestyle as me, and they're starting to get these other views, you know, in terms of anti-refugee views or, you know, anti-women's rights, which is so strange to me. But I suppose to them, that is the truth.
Yeah.
While to me, it's not. And how do you convince someone that?
It's interesting, because it's like, and it was something we talked about a lot about when we were writing Crashing, was like, you know, we're living so much as young women through Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and the internet. And you see everything on the internet, but you feel so helpless.
Yeah.
So I would imagine, as anyone, as, you know, empathic human beings, we're going to want to help people. But if you're getting bombarded with a very particular view, which is a more fascist view, and they're saying they're going to help people, I would imagine that someone then will go, okay, cool, this is my tribe. I found the people that we're going to take over the world together. This is going to be great.
Yeah, especially because everyone is getting more and more divided.
Yeah.
So if you don't fully, you know, connect with the left-wing views, then you might go, oh, well, these right-wing groups, they're for me.
Totally.
That's it. And sometimes for people, it's, you know, their way of coping with everything that's going on in the world, which, you know, at the end of the day, these are humans too who might feel lonely or helpless, like you said. And
completely.
This is their way of coping with it. But, you know, that's becoming harmful at times now as well. So,
totally. Do you think, like, as young women, as young artists, we have to say something about it?
I think that often we might feel, oh, it's not my place, or I don't know enough about it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people are guilted into feeling like they have to say something. But at the end of the day, if you feel like you don't have to say anything, you're quite lucky in that way.
Yeah, totally.
What do you think?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Like, it's, if you feel like, oh, this is a new issue for me, it kind of does make you think, like, okay, you've never had to deal with that issue before. I think as well, like, I can only speak for me, and I'm sure you're quite similar, like, the people I surround myself with, which are you, our close friends, our families, but if we're talking about, like, our friends our age, they are super engaged and socially engaged. So, and as an artist, as songwriters, we write about what's going on in our lives and what's going on in the world around us. So I don't feel like I have to write about it, but it just makes sense to write about it, because it's like,
if we're writing about our lives, this is becoming our lives now and a big issue in our lives.
Yeah, and like, there's only so much you can write about, oh, someone broke my heart. You know what I mean? I think, like, as we get older, you know, we're only 23, but as we get older, it's like you see that the world is just so much more than, like, your tiny bubble. You know, you really have to, like, your views open up way more, as in that. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
that kind of
completely.
idea that, like, as you know, as young artists, it's very much, okay, what's in my bubble right now? As we get older, it's okay, well, I'm part of a society.
Yeah.
And how am I kind of making a statement or making a mark on that, you know? So have you any other finishing points you want to mention?
I think one thing that just keeps coming up in my mind is that empathy and education are always going to be what is going to help us in the long run. You know, it's one thing to, like I said, everyone is so divided, and it's one thing to, you know, criticize people that you don't agree with. But if we empathize with people, maybe see why they have those views, and then welcome them in and educate and get more points of views, more diverse points of views, I think that's how we are going to move forward and, you know, prevent maybe more young people getting more right wing.
Completely, I completely agree with you that, like, and I'm so guilty of it. I've had conversations with people who don't share my views on things, and because I'm quite an emotional person, I have quite an emotional attachment to some views, and then I get emotional and it's all anger, and it's, but
and you're not alone in that.
Yeah, so that's the thing. But it's so helpful to remember that, okay, this person I'm having this discussion with is still a human, and though I might not agree with them, I need to listen to them, and hopefully they will listen to me too. And I think once we have a more open dialogue, we'll stop being so polarised, hopefully.
Yeah, that's the first step.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Carla and Ellen, for sharing your views with us today. So a huge thank you to all our speakers, and of course to Smashing Times for organising this, and the theme of the event, Artists Against Fascism. To hear more, please go to their website, which is smashingtimes.ie. And I suppose for me, my final words for today's event is, we as a mom, I think I've always been very passionate about equality and inclusion and creating a more compassionate world, especially now that I work in the field of mental health. But as a mom in particular, I feel we all have a responsibility to, you know, I think I always feel my own vision is to try and leave this world somewhat better than how I found it. And I think the work that Smashing Times are doing today, and, you know, rallying the artists against fascism, is really a great way to shed light on the importance of keep striving to create a more inclusive, more diverse world, especially in the light of these days with COVID-19. It's, you know, that tends to be very much at the forefront of people's minds. So we must not forget that issues like equality, inclusion, diversity have to remain on the agenda, irrespective of whatever is happening. Because as COVID-19 has shown, that it's the people who are most vulnerable, who are you know, unequal, who feel excluded, are the very ones who are bearing the greatest, I suppose, toll in relation to COVID-19. So thank you so much for joining us today. And remember, you can be a change maker as well, and stand up to fascism, and do what you can by getting involved with Smashing Times. Thank you.